The phone rang at exactly 7:43 p.m., cutting through the forced politeness of Sunday dinner like a blade through silk. My mother's crystal water glasses trembled slightly on the mahogany table as the encrypted satellite phone, the one I kept buried in my purse for emergencies that could reshape nations, began its unmistakable digital chirp. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Every face at the dining room table turned toward me. My stepfather Richard paused mid-chew, his fork suspended over the prime rib he'd been bragging about for the past 20 minutes. My half-sister Emma's perfectly glossed lips formed a small O of annoyance, as if the interruption was a personal affront to her ongoing monologue about her latest interior design project. Even my nephew Tyler looked up from his phone, momentarily distracted from whatever social media crisis had been consuming his teenage attention. "Sarah," my mother said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of controlled irritation, "can't you turn that thing off? We're having family time." Family time. The phrase sat bitter on my tongue. I'd driven 3 hours from my apartment in Arlington to the sprawling Colonial in Greenwich, Connecticut, because my mother had insisted, practically begged, that I attend what she called a reconciliation dinner. 6 months had passed since our last conversation, which had ended with her telling me I was an embarrassment to the Caldwell name and that my little government job was nothing more than glorified secretarial work. The phone continued its urgent symphony. I recognized the pattern immediately. 3 long chirps, 2 short, 3 long again, priority alpha, director level. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. "I have to take this," I said, already pushing back from the table. "No, you don't," Emma interjected, setting down her wine glass with theatrical precision. "Whatever filing emergency you have at the State Department can wait until after dessert." The State Department. That's what they all believed. What my mother had told everyone for the past 8 years. That I was some mid-level bureaucrat shuffling papers and scheduling meetings for diplomats. It was easier than explaining that their disappointing daughter, the one who'd dropped out of law school and thrown her life away on what they called a whim, was actually one of 37 people in the country with level 5 security clearance. "Sarah," my mother's voice sharpened, "sit down, please. For once, can't you just be present with us?" Present. As if I hadn't been present for every family crisis, every financial emergency, every time they needed someone reliable to handle the uncomfortable details of real life while they maintained their carefully curated facades. I'd been present when Richard's business nearly collapsed, and I'd quietly connected him with the right people to secure government contracts. I'd been present when Emma's first marriage imploded, and I'd used my connections to ensure her ex-husband's threats never materialized into anything actionable. I'd been present through my mother's cancer scare, coordinating with specialists and ensuring she received care that her insurance would never have covered. But none of that presence counted because it wasn't the kind they could photograph for Christmas cards or mention at their country club brunches. The phone rang again. Priority Alpha didn't wait for family dynamics. "This will just take a minute," I said, stepping toward the hallway. "It's always just a minute with you," my mother called after me, "and then you disappear for months." I paused at the threshold of the dining room, looking back at these people who shared my DNA but had never bothered to know who I actually was. Richard had returned to his prime rib, already dismissing me. Emma was checking her reflection in the back of her spoon, preparing for whatever performance would come next. Tyler had his earbuds back in. Only my mother was still watching me, her gray eyes holding that familiar mixture of disappointment and resignation that had defined our relationship for as long as I could remember. "1 minute," I repeated and walked into the hallway. The secure phone felt heavy in my hand as I pressed the encrypted connection. The voice that answered was one I'd heard exactly 4 times in my 8-year career, and never on a Sunday evening. "Mitchell." Director Patricia Hawthorne's voice cut through the digital static with surgical precision. "Where are you?" "Connecticut, ma'am, with family." A pause. In the background, I could hear the distinctive hum of the 7th floor at Langley, the kind of activity that meant something significant was happening in real time. "We have a situation developing in Prague. Asset compromised, 3 agents offline, and a weapons cache that's about to disappear into very wrong hands." I need you operational in 4 hours. My mouth went dry. Prague meant Eastern European networks, which meant my specialty, the deep cover infiltration work that only 5 people in the agency were trained to handle. The kind of assignment that didn't exist on any official record and couldn't be discussed with anyone who didn't have clearance levels that most government officials would never achieve. Ma'am, I'm currently 3 hours from Mitchell. Her voice dropped to that tone that had earned her the nickname the surgeon among field operatives. This is not a request. This is a direct order from someone whose title I cannot speak over this line, but whose authority you understand. You have a helicopter inbound to the Westchester County Airport, 45 minutes. A helicopter to Westchester. Which meant they'd traced my location, activated emergency protocols, and were pulling me out of civilian life in the middle of Sunday dinner. Which meant whatever was happening in Prague was significant enough to justify exposing operational security and potentially compromising my cover identity. Understood, ma'am. And Mitchell, pack for cold weather. You might be there longer than usual. The line went dead. I stood in my mother's hallway, surrounded by family photos that documented a life I'd never really been part of, holding a phone that connected me to a world they couldn't imagine existed. Through the dining room doorway, I could hear Emma launching into a story about her yoga instructor's divorce, her voice bright, with the kind of gossip that filled the spaces where real conversation should live. 45 minutes to Westchester. I needed to leave now. I walked back into the dining room and began collecting my purse and jacket from the chair where I'd left them. Where are you going? My mother asked, her voice rising with familiar frustration. I have to leave. Something came up at work. Work? Emma's laugh was sharp and dismissive. On a Sunday night, what kind of filing emergency requires you to abandon family dinner? Richard didn't look up from his plate. She's always been unreliable, Patricia. Remember when she missed your birthday party for that work conference in Switzerland? That work conference in Switzerland had been a 3-week operation dismantling a human trafficking network that had been moving children through diplomatic channels. I'd spent my 30th birthday in a safe house in Zurich, debriefing assets, and coordinating with Interpol to ensure 17 children were returned to their families. But I couldn't tell them that. I couldn't tell them about any of it. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it more than they could possibly understand. This is important. More important than your family? My mother's voice cracked slightly, revealing the hurt beneath her anger. I looked at her across the dining room table, this woman who had raised me and loved me in the only way she knew how, but who had also made it clear that love came with conditions I could never meet, while doing the work that gave my life meaning. Yes, I said quietly, it is. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet of shared meals. This was the silence of bridges burning, of relationships reaching their breaking point, of truths that couldn't be unsaid. Then go, my mother said, her voice cold and final. Go back to your mysterious little job and your secret life. But don't expect us to keep pretending we're proud of you when you clearly have no respect for this family. I wanted to tell her that I carried their safety with me every day, that my work protected them in ways they'd never know. I wanted to explain that my absence wasn't indifference but necessity, that the silence wasn't shame but security protocol. I wanted her to understand that I'd chosen a life of service over a life of comfort, and that choice had cost me more than she could imagine. Instead, I picked up my car keys and walked toward the front door. Outside, the Connecticut evening was crisp and clear, stars barely visible through the suburban light pollution. Somewhere in the distance, I could already hear the faint thrum of rotor blades cutting through the autumn air, growing steadily louder as it approached. I had never felt more alone or more certain that I was exactly where I belonged. The helicopter's interior was stark and functional, nothing like the luxury aircraft my family probably imagined government officials used. I strapped myself into the jump seat as we lifted off from Westchester, watching the lights of Connecticut suburbia shrink below us. The pilot, a stone-faced woman with close-cropped gray hair, handed me a sealed envelope marked with classification levels that would make most senators nervous. As I broke the wax seal, my mind drifted back to how this all began. 8 years ago, I'd been Sarah Caldwell, law student at Yale, destined for a partnership track at my stepfather's firm. The golden child, finally living up to the potential my mother had always seen in me. Richard had already offered me a corner office, complete with a view of Hartford's financial district, and a salary that would have made my trust fund look like pocket change. But then Professor Hernandez assigned us a constitutional law paper on surveillance powers, and I'd stumbled across a classified leak that had been buried in congressional testimony. Something about domestic intelligence operations that didn't match the official narrative. Most students would have written their papers and moved on. I couldn't let it go. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. 3 weeks of digging led me to a coffee shop meeting with someone who called himself David and wore the kind of unremarkable clothes that screamed federal agent. He listened to my questions for exactly 12 minutes, then asked me one of his own. What would you do if you discovered your government was lying to protect its citizens rather than control them? I thought I knew the answer. I thought I understood the difference between right and wrong, legal and illegal, patriotic and treasonous. I was 24 and brilliant and completely naive. David handed me a business card with only a phone number. If you want real answers, he said, call this number. But understand, once you start down this path, your old life ends. No exceptions. I kept the card for 3 months, tucked behind my driver's license like a secret I couldn't decide whether to keep or discard. During that time, I watched my classmates prepare for corporate law careers, judicial clerkships, public defender positions, normal paths that led to normal lives. I attended law review meetings and moot court competitions and career fairs, where recruiters promised me a future that looked exactly like what everyone expected. But late at night, alone in my dorm room, I researched the cases that never made it to public trial. The investigations ended abruptly. The journalists who stopped asking certain questions. The pattern became impossible to ignore. There was a war being fought in the shadows, and most people had no idea it existed. The night I finally made the call, my mother had just finished planning my graduation party. She'd invited half of Greenwich, ordered catering from that expensive place on the Upper East Side, even hired a photographer to capture what she called the beginning of Sarah's real life. I stared at the invitation proofs spread across my desk, elegant script announcing my acceptance to Richard's firm, and dialed the number. 6 weeks later, I was in a nondescript building in Virginia, undergoing psychological evaluations that probed deeper than any therapy session I'd ever imagined. They asked me about my childhood, my relationships, my fears, my motivations. They wanted to know if I could lie to the people I loved, if I could maintain a cover identity for years without breaking, if I could make decisions that would haunt me but protect millions of people who would never know my name. The hardest question came from Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, a psychiatrist whose clearance level was so high she'd probably read my thoughts before I'd finished thinking them. Are you prepared to become a ghost in your own life? I said yes because I thought I understood what she meant. I thought it was about maintaining cover identities and living under assumed names in foreign countries. I had no idea she meant I'd become a ghost to my own family. The training was 18 months of hell disguised as education. I learned 7 languages, memorized the facial bone structure patterns of terrorist networks, studied weapon systems that didn't officially exist. I was taught how to kill silently, how to extract information without leaving physical evidence, how to disappear completely and reappear as someone else entirely. But the hardest skill was learning how to lie to my mother. The State Department cover story wasn't my idea. It came from the behavioral psychology team, who'd analyzed my family dynamics and determined that my mother needed to believe I was still respectable, just boring. They crafted an entire fictional career, entry-level foreign service officer, posted to safe embassy locations, handling visa applications and cultural exchange programs. Nothing exciting enough to discuss at dinner parties, but nothing shameful enough to disown. My first assignment was 6 months in Morocco, infiltrating an arms dealing network that was funneling weapons to extremist groups across North Africa. I told my family I was processing immigration paperwork in Rabat and learning Arabic for cultural sensitivity training. While they imagined me stamping passports in an air-conditioned office, I was living in a compound outside Casablanca, building an identity as a corrupt American diplomat willing to expedite certain transactions for the right price. The operation succeeded beyond all projections. We dismantled a network that had been operating for 12 years, prevented 3 planned attacks on civilian targets, and recovered enough weapons to supply a small army. My team leader called it a textbook infiltration. The Moroccan intelligence service awarded me a commendation that I could never display. The State Department cover office sent my mother a form letter about my adequate performance in routine administrative duties. Quote, "When I came home for Christmas that year, Emma complained that I looked tired and suggested I consider a career change because government work was obviously not suited to my personality. Richard asked if I'd met any ambassadors and seemed disappointed when I said no. My mother worried that I wasn't dating anyone and wondered if my little job overseas was preventing me from meeting suitable men. None of them noticed the new way I scanned rooms when I entered them, or how I instinctively positioned myself near exits, or that I'd developed the habit of memorizing license plates in parking lots. They didn't see the way I flinched when car doors slammed unexpectedly, or recognize that my improved language skills came from months of high-stress conversations where a mispronounced word could have gotten me killed. Over the next 7 years, the assignments got more complex, and the lies got easier. I told them I was stationed in Prague while I spent 3 months in Syria, posing as a journalist to document chemical weapons facilities. I claimed to be working on trade agreements in Geneva while I was actually coordinating with MI6 to expose a human trafficking ring that reached into the highest levels of the European government. When I said I was attending boring conferences in Vienna, I was really running assets in Moscow who were feeding us intelligence about nuclear proliferation programs. Each successful mission earned me higher clearance levels and more dangerous assignments. Each homecoming required more elaborate deceptions and more careful omissions. I became fluent in the language of half-truths and strategic silence, crafting stories that were boring enough to discourage follow-up questions, while containing just enough detail to seem authentic. But the cost was higher than I'd anticipated. Every family gathering became a performance where I had to remember which version of myself I was supposed to be. Every conversation required mental translation, filtering out anything that might accidentally reveal the truth. I watched my relationships with my family become into polite routine, based on a version of me that didn't actually exist. The irony was devastating. I'd spent 8 years protecting national security, preventing terrorist attacks, and safeguarding millions of American lives. But I couldn't protect the one thing that mattered most to me personally, my connection to the people who had raised me. And now, flying through the darkness toward an emergency that might very well be my last mission, I realized that tonight's phone call hadn't just interrupted Sunday dinner. It had shattered the final pretense that I could keep living in both worlds simultaneously. The classified briefing in my hands detailed a situation in Prague that would require me to use every skill I'd learned, every contact I'd cultivated, and every sacrifice I'd made over the past 8 years. As I read the intelligence reports, one thought crystallized with painful clarity: win or lose. After this mission, there would be no going back to being the boring State Department employee who disappointed her family with her lack of ambition. The truth was about to surface, whether I wanted it to or not. The helicopter touched down at Andrews Air Force Base at 9:47 p.m., where a black sedan waited with its engine running. No driver introductions, no small talk, just a silent 40-minute ride through Washington traffic that felt heavier than usual for a Sunday night. I studied the Prague files during the drive, memorizing names, faces, and protocol codes that would either save lives or end them, depending on how the next 72 hours unfolded. The briefing room at Langley was tomb quiet when I arrived, illuminated only by the blue glow of encrypted monitors and the sterile fluorescent lights that never dimmed. Director Hawthorne stood at the head of a conference table scarred with coffee rings and decades of classified conversations. Around the table sat the kind of people whose existence was neither confirmed nor denied by official government sources. Prague Station went dark 4 hours ago, Hawthorne began without preamble. Our asset inside the Kozlov Arms network transmitted a priority alert about a weapons cache being moved through diplomatic channels, then disappeared. 3 backup agents sent to investigate have not reported in. Czech intelligence claims no knowledge of any operations in their territory. She clicked a remote, and the wall screen filled with satellite imagery of a nondescript warehouse district. Red markers indicated last known positions of missing personnel. The weapons in question aren't conventional arms. We're talking about next-generation biotechnology that could weaponize existing pandemic strains and make them airborne transmissible within hours instead of weeks. My blood went cold. Bioweapons meant potential casualties in the millions, not thousands. This wasn't about preventing a terrorist attack. This was about preventing a global catastrophe that could rewrite the demographic map of entire continents. Intelligence suggests the sale is happening tomorrow night, Hawthorne continued. Buyer unknown, but financial traces indicate Middle Eastern state actors with demonstrated willingness to deploy unconventional weapons against civilian populations. Deputy Director Marcus Webb, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, leaned forward. Here's where it gets complicated, Mitchell. The only viable extraction point for this material is through a diplomatic reception at the Czech Foreign Ministry. Black tie event, international guests, security protocols that would make a prison look casual. I understood immediately. A diplomatic reception meant I couldn't go in armed, couldn't rely on backup, couldn't even carry standard communication equipment without risking detection by embassy security scanners. It would be what the agency called a naked operation. No weapons, no support, no official existence if everything went wrong. The Czech ambassador's wife is hosting a cultural exchange event, Webb explained, sliding a thick dossier across the table. Art collectors, museum curators, university professors, the kind of people who discuss Renaissance painters over champagne and never ask uncomfortable questions about each other's day jobs. Your cover identity is Dr. Sarah Reynolds, art authentication specialist from Georgetown University. Dr. Reynolds. I'd used that identity twice before, once in Vienna and once in Florence. The agency had spent 3 years building her academic credentials, publishing papers in her name, establishing a reputation for discretion among private collectors who valued anonymity over transparency. It was a solid cover, but using it in Prague meant burning it forever after this mission. The weapons cache is being stored in a climate-controlled vault beneath the embassy, Webb continued. Our missing asset managed to confirm the location before going silent, but the security system requires biometric access from someone with diplomatic immunity. We need you to get close to Deputy Cultural Attaché Victor Mendez during the reception and obtain his access codes. Hawthorne's expression grew grim. Mendez doesn't know what's in that vault. He's not part of the conspiracy. He's just the key to the lock. But Mitchell, understand this. Once you're inside that embassy, you're on sovereign foreign soil. If you're caught, if you're compromised, if anything goes wrong, the United States government will deny any knowledge of your existence. You'll be charged as a criminal trespasser under Czech law, and we can't intervene without creating an international incident. The room fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of night shift personnel moving through corridors that didn't appear on any public building schematics. I stared at the satellite images on the screen, thinking about bioweapons that could kill millions and 3 missing agents who might already be dead. But my mind also drifted to the dinner table I'd abandoned 3 hours ago, to my mother's disappointed face and Emma's dismissive laughter. They thought I was ashamed of them, that I avoided family gatherings because I considered myself too important for their suburban concerns. They had no idea I avoided them, because my presence put them in danger. Because people who wanted to hurt me might use them as leverage. Because the less they knew about my real life, the safer they were. There's something else, Hawthorne said quietly. The Czech reception is being covered by international media. Social pages, cultural magazines, the kind of publicity that diplomatic families love. If you accept this mission, if you attend that event, there's a significant chance your photograph will appear in publications that your family might see. My stomach dropped. Dr. Sarah Reynolds looked exactly like Sarah Mitchell, just with different hair and better clothes. If my photo appeared in a magazine identifying me as a Georgetown art professor attending a Prague cultural event, while my family believed I was a low-level State Department clerk, the discrepancy would be impossible to explain. Ma'am, I said carefully, what are the chances that media coverage would reach American publications? Webb consulted his tablet. Diplomatic receptions usually generate photos for European society magazines. But this particular event is featuring a recently discovered Caravaggio, which means American art publications will definitely be interested. Conservative estimate? 70% chance your photo appears in at least one American magazine within 2 weeks. 70%. Which meant there was a 70% chance that my carefully maintained cover story would explode spectacularly, that my family would learn I'd been lying to them for 8 years, that every conversation we'd had about my boring government job would be revealed as elaborate deception. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked. Hawthorne checked her watch. "Your flight to Prague leaves in 6 hours. If you're not on it, we'll have to consider alternative extraction methods that are significantly more likely to result in civilian casualties." Alternative extraction methods. That was the agency's speak for military intervention, which in a European capital would mean special forces operations that could destabilize NATO relationships and trigger the kind of international crisis that intelligence work was designed to prevent. I thought about the bioweapons that could kill millions of innocent people. I thought about 3 missing agents who might still be alive and waiting for rescue. I thought about my oath to protect American lives and global security, regardless of personal cost. And then I thought about my mother, who had finally learned that her disappointing daughter had spent 8 years preventing exactly the kind of catastrophes that kept world leaders awake at night. I thought about Emma, who would discover that her boring half-sister had been living the kind of life that spy novels barely dared to imagine. I thought about Richard, who would realize that the woman he'd dismissed as unmotivated had been serving her country in ways he couldn't comprehend. The irony was almost unbearable. After 8 years of hiding my accomplishments to protect my family's security, this mission would force me to reveal everything just when the stakes were highest. "If I do this," I said slowly, "and my cover is blown, what kind of protection can the agency provide for my family?" "Full witness protection protocols if necessary," Hawthorne replied immediately. "New identities, relocation, financial support. But Mitchell, that's a last resort. We're hoping the media attention will be minimal and focused on the art exhibition rather than individual guests." Hoping. The most dangerous word in intelligence work. I closed my eyes and made the calculation that field operatives learn to make. Weigh the certainty of personal loss against the probability of catastrophic consequences. 3 missing agents, millions of potential casualties, and bioweapons that could reshape global power structures, all balanced against my family's comfort and my own carefully constructed anonymity. When I opened my eyes, everyone in the room was watching me with the kind of patience that suggested they already knew what I would choose. "I'll need the Georgetown University credentials updated and a complete briefing on Caravaggio authentication techniques," I said. "And I want a backup extraction plan that doesn't involve military intervention." Hawthorne nodded. "Done. Your flight leaves at 0400 hours. As I walked out of the briefing room, I realized I was about to risk everything I'd spent 8 years protecting, for the sake of protecting everything I'd sworn to defend. The decision felt both inevitable and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff while knowing it was the only way to prevent an avalanche. In 6 hours, I would be Dr. Sarah Reynolds, art expert and unwitting participant in what might become the most photographed cultural event of the year. And Sarah Mitchell, the disappointing daughter who'd been lying to her family for nearly a decade, might finally be forced to tell the truth. The Baroque grandeur of Prague's Foreign Ministry building gleamed under spotlights as my taxi pulled up to the red carpet entrance. Crystal chandeliers visible through towering windows cast geometric shadows across cobblestone courtyards that had witnessed centuries of diplomatic intrigue. I stepped out wearing a midnight blue silk gown that cost more than most people's monthly salary, my hair swept into an elegant chignon that concealed the nearly invisible communication device nestled behind my left ear. Dr. Sarah Reynolds carried herself differently than Sarah Mitchell ever had. Her posture spoke of academic confidence earned through years of studying Renaissance masters. Her smile suggested someone comfortable discussing million-dollar art acquisitions over cocktails, with people whose names appeared in Forbes magazine. The transformation was complete down to the custom-made Italian heels that contained hidden compartments for lockpicking tools and emergency currency. Security at the embassy entrance was thorough but polite, metal detectors disguised as elegant archways, diplomatic personnel who managed to check credentials while making small talk about the evening's featured exhibition. My Georgetown University identification and Dr. Reynolds' established reputation opened doors that would have remained sealed to most intelligence operatives. Sometimes the best disguise was simply being exactly who you appeared to be. Dr. Reynolds, a crisp voice called as I entered the main reception hall. I'm Cultural Secretary Martinez. We spoke on the phone about the Caravaggio authentication protocols. Elena Martinez was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 35, with the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested she'd earned her diplomatic posting through merit rather than connections. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and her eyes held the subtle wariness that came from working in international relations, where every conversation carried multiple layers of meaning. Secretary Martinez, what an honor. I've been looking forward to examining the piece ever since you mentioned its provenance might trace back to the Matisse collection. As we walked through the reception hall, I cataloged exit routes, security camera positions, and the subtle bulges that indicated which guests were carrying concealed weapons. Diplomatic receptions were theaters of civilized pretense, where arms dealers discussed humanitarian projects, and intelligence officers masqueraded as cultural attachés, all while photographers captured smiles for tomorrow's society pages. The Caravaggio hung in a climate-controlled alcove, surrounded by laser security systems that would make bank vaults envious. The penitent Magdalene, Martinez explained, her voice dropping to the reverential whisper that priceless art seemed to command. Discovered in a Prague estate sale just 6 months ago, previous owners had no idea what they possessed. I studied the painting with the practiced eye that 3 years of Dr. Reynolds' academic identity had cultivated. The brushwork was unmistakably Caravaggio, those dramatic contrasts of light and shadow that made his subjects seem to breathe on canvas. But something about the pigment composition seemed inconsistent with early 17th century techniques. Fascinating piece, I murmured, noting the strategically placed mirrors that would reflect anyone attempting to access the vault entrance I'd spotted behind a false wall panel. The emotional intensity is certainly characteristic of Caravaggio's Roman period, though I'd love to examine the underpainting before offering a definitive authentication. Of course, Deputy Attaché Mendez handles our archival access protocols. Let me introduce you. Quote, Victor Mendez stood near the champagne service, a man in his 50s whose expensive suit couldn't quite disguise the soft physique of someone more comfortable with paperwork than physical challenges. His laugh was too loud, his handshake too eager, and his eyes held the slight desperation of a career diplomat who'd never quite achieved the prominence he'd dreamed of in graduate school. Dr. Reynolds, I've read your papers on Renaissance authentication techniques. Brilliant work on the disputed Raphael at the Met. The disputed Raphael paper was one of my favorites. 6 months of research that had been published under Dr. Reynolds' name while I was actually running surveillance on Syrian chemical weapons facilities. The irony of discussing fictional academic achievements while preparing to prevent biological warfare was not lost on me. You're too kind, Deputy Attaché. Secretary Martinez mentioned you oversee archival access. I'd be fascinated to examine Caravaggio's X-ray imaging and spectral analysis data. Absolutely. Though I should mention, our security protocols are quite rigorous. Archive access requires biometric verification and dual authorization codes. We can't be too careful with pieces of this caliber. Perfect. He'd essentially outlined the exact security measures I needed to bypass, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone proud of his institutional responsibilities. I smiled appreciatively while mentally cataloging the biometric scanners I'd noticed near what appeared to be an elevator marked, Authorized Personnel Only. As the evening progressed, I mingled with the crowd of art collectors, museum curators, and cultural enthusiasts who populated international receptions like this. Conversations flowed from Renaissance painting techniques to contemporary sculpture markets, punctuated by the discreet photography of social correspondents who captured carefully posed moments for tomorrow's cultural coverage. Dr. Catherine Walsh from the Smithsonian discussed her recent acquisition of a disputed Monet. Professor Heinrich Müller from the Berlin Academy shared gossip about authentication scandals involving Swiss private collections. Investment banker Robert Carlyle explained how art portfolios had outperformed traditional securities over the past decade, his wife nodding enthusiastically while photographing every detail of the evening for her Instagram followers. Each conversation required complete attention to maintain drive. Reynolds' academic persona, but my peripheral awareness tracked Mendez's movements throughout the reception hall. He checked his phone frequently, spoke briefly with embassy security personnel, and twice excused himself to access restricted areas of the building. The pattern suggested someone managing multiple responsibilities beyond simple cultural diplomacy. Around 10:30, a commotion near the main entrance drew everyone's attention. A distinguished man in his 70s, wearing a military dress uniform adorned with decorations I couldn't immediately identify, had arrived with an entourage that included several individuals whose bearings screamed intelligence operatives from various European services. "General Novak," Martinez whispered to me, her voice tight with sudden tension. "Check military intelligence. He wasn't on tonight's guest list." General Novak's unexpected arrival shifted the entire atmosphere of the reception. Conversations became more guarded, laughter more forced, and several guests began making polite excuses to leave early. Whatever his purpose here, it wasn't social. Mendez appeared visibly nervous, checking his phone more frequently and glancing toward the archive elevator with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering his evening plans. When Novak's security detail began what appeared to be casual reconnaissance of the reception hall, I realized that my timeline for accessing the vault had just accelerated dramatically. The bioweapons cache wasn't just being stored beneath this embassy. It was being monitored by Czech intelligence, which meant either they were complicit in the arms deal or they were conducting their own investigation. Either scenario made my mission exponentially more dangerous. As photographers continued capturing the evening's festivities, I caught my reflection in one of the ornate mirrors lining the reception hall. Dr. Sarah Reynolds looked perfectly composed, just another academic enjoying an evening of cultural sophistication. But Sarah Mitchell understood that she was standing in the center of an intelligence operation that was far more complex than the briefing documents had suggested. The weapons cache, the missing agents, the diplomatic reception, and now unexpected military intelligence presence. All the pieces were connected in ways that meant tomorrow's newspaper coverage would be the least of my concerns. I needed to access that vault within the next hour, before General Novak's investigation discovered what was hidden below our feet. But doing so would require getting past security systems designed to detect exactly the kind of infiltration I was planning, while maintaining my academic cover among witnesses who would remember every detail if questioned later. The champagne in my glass suddenly tasted like the metallic edge of adrenaline that preceded the most dangerous operations. Around me, Prague's cultural elite continued their civilized conversations about art and politics, completely unaware that their elegant evening was about to become ground zero for preventing a biological weapons catastrophe. Dr. Reynolds smiled politely at another guest's observation about Baroque architectural influences, while Sarah Mitchell calculated the probability of successfully completing her mission before this diplomatic reception became a crime scene. The vault door sealed behind me with the whisper-quiet precision of Swiss engineering, leaving me alone in a climate-controlled chamber that hummed with the subtle vibration of air filtration systems. Emergency lighting cast everything in an amber glow that made the rows of secured storage units look like metallic coffins. I had exactly 17 minutes before Mendez's security rotation discovered his biometric signature had been compromised. The weapons cache occupied Unit 47C, behind titanium locks that required both digital codes and physical keycards. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, deploying tools that officially didn't exist, while my mind tracked the seconds that separated success from catastrophic failure. Above me, the diplomatic reception continued its civilized charade, champagne glasses chiming against the backdrop of cultural conversation that would turn to screaming if anyone discovered what lay beneath their feet. 16 minutes. The lock mechanism surrendered to techniques I'd learned in facilities that weren't marked on any government maps. Inside the unit, foam-padded cases contained vials that looked deceptively innocent, clear liquids that could be mistaken for expensive perfume or premium vodka. But the biohazard symbols etched into each container told a different story. These weren't just biological weapons. They were extinction-level pathogens, engineered to spread faster than any natural pandemic humanity had ever faced. My encrypted phone vibrated once, the signal that extraction was ready. All I had to do was document the contents, plant tracking devices, and disappear back into the reception before anyone noticed Dr. Sarah Reynolds had been absent from the Caravaggio discussion. Simple, clean, professional. That's when I heard the voices in the corridor outside. Confirmed the breach in archival security. Someone accessed the vault using Mendez's credentials approximately 8 minutes ago. The voice belonged to General Novak, his Czech accent heavy with military authority. Impossible. Mendez has been visible in the reception hall all evening. That was Martinez, her diplomatic training evident in the controlled calm of her response. Nevertheless, our monitoring systems detected unauthorized biometric access. The intruder is still inside. My blood turned to ice water. They'd been watching the vault the entire time, which meant this wasn't a storage facility. It was a trap. The bioweapons were bait, and I'd walked directly into whatever net they'd been preparing for months. 15 minutes until security rotation. But that timeline was now meaningless, because Czech intelligence was already mobilizing response teams that would seal every exit from this building within the next 60 seconds. My phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Abort. Extract immediately. Do not compromise cover. But extracting meant leaving the bioweapons in place, and the intelligence briefing had been clear about the consequences of that choice. Tomorrow night's sale would proceed as planned, putting extinction-level pathogens in the hands of state actors who'd already demonstrated their willingness to deploy unconventional weapons against civilian populations. I could hear footsteps in the corridor now, the measured pace of security personnel, who were trained to contain rather than capture. They wanted me alive, which meant interrogation, which meant discovering not just Dr. Sarah Reynolds' identity, but the entire intelligence network that had supported this operation. My fingers found the emergency beacon hidden in my bracelet clasp, a device that would summon extraction assets but also reveal the CIA's involvement to Czech intelligence. Using it would create an international incident that could destabilize NATO relationships and compromise every agent operating in Eastern Europe. But not using it meant facing interrogation by a military intelligence service that had perfected techniques the Geneva Convention preferred not to acknowledge. The footsteps stopped directly outside the vault entrance. I heard the distinctive beep of security codes being entered, then the mechanical whisper of locks disengaging. In 30 seconds, the vault door would open to reveal not an empty chamber but an American intelligence operative surrounded by biological weapons that could rewrite the demographic map of continents. That's when my personal phone, the civilian device I'd forgotten to silence, began ringing with a tone I recognized immediately. Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11. The ringtone I'd assigned to family calls because it was the only piece of classical music my mother had ever played when I was growing up. The sound echoed through the vault like a gunshot, betraying my location with acoustic precision that made stealth impossible. But worse than tactical exposure was the emotional recognition that flooded through me. Someone from my family was calling at 11:47 p.m. Prague time, which meant 5:47 p.m. Connecticut time, which meant something was wrong. The vault door began its automated opening sequence as I stared at my phone's display. "Mom calling." The words seemed to glow with accusatory brightness in the amber emergency lighting. I answered the call because in 8 years of intelligence work, I'd learned that family emergencies didn't wait for convenient timing. "Sarah?" My mother's voice was thick with tears and panic. "Sarah, thank God. There's been an accident. Richard's in the hospital. They don't know if he's going to." The vault door finished opening to reveal General Novak flanked by 4 armed security officers whose weapons were trained on my position, with the kind of steady precision that suggested extensive tactical training. Their faces showed no emotion, just professional assessment of threat levels and containment protocols. "The doctors say the next few hours are critical and Emma's falling apart and I don't know what to do and I know you're angry with us, but please, Sarah, please just come home." My mother's voice continued pouring through the phone while I stood in a vault full of biological weapons, surrounded by Czech military intelligence, holding devices that could either summon American extraction assets or document evidence that might prevent global catastrophe. General Novak's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something approaching curiosity as he heard my mother's desperate pleas echoing through the chamber. His English was accented but precise. Dr. Reynolds, I presume? Though I suspect that name is as fictional as your academic credentials. I could end the call, deploy the emergency beacon, and disappear into extraction protocols that would erase Sarah Mitchell's existence while protecting Dr. Reynolds' cover. I could document the bioweapons, compromise my position, but ensure the intelligence reached agencies that could prevent their deployment. Or I could abandon the mission entirely and rush home to a family that had spent 8 years dismissing my sacrifices while never understanding the dangers I'd face to keep them safe. And I know I said terrible things at dinner, but I didn't mean them, and you're not ashamed to this family. You're the strongest person I know, and I should have told you that years ago. My mother's words hit harder than any interrogation technique Czech intelligence could deploy. She was apologizing for wounds that ran deeper than she knew, trying to heal a relationship that had been fractured by lies I'd told to protect her from truths she couldn't handle. General Novak gestured to his security team, and I heard the distinctive sound of weapons being readied for firing. Whatever decision I made in the next 10 seconds would determine not just the fate of millions of potential bioweapons casualties, but also whether I'd see my family again before they buried the stepfather who'd raised me despite never understanding who I'd become. "Mom," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the chaos surrounding me. "I'm going to call you back in 5 minutes." I ended the call and looked directly at General Novak, whose expression suggested he'd been listening to every word with the kind of analytical attention that intelligence officers brought to interrogation transcripts. "General," I said, setting my phone down carefully while keeping my hands visible, "I believe we need to discuss the contents of this vault before anyone makes decisions they'll regret." His smile was cold and precise, the expression of someone who'd just gained significant leverage in a negotiation he'd been planning for months. "Indeed we do, Agent Mitchell. Indeed we do." The sound of my real name in his voice meant that my cover wasn't just blown, it had never existed. This entire operation had been a setup from the beginning, and I'd walked into it because I'd been so focused on protecting my family from my work that I'd never considered my work might be used to threaten my family. But as I stood surrounded by weapons and adversaries, listening to the echo of my mother's tears through the chamber's sterile air, one thought crystallized with absolute clarity. Whatever happened next, the lies were finally over. The truth was about to surface in ways that would change everything, whether I survived to explain it or not. General Novak's interrogation room was sterile efficiency disguised as diplomatic courtesy, mahogany table, leather chairs, and coffee that smelled expensive enough to mask the underlying scent of fear that permeated intelligence facilities worldwide. The walls held oil paintings of Czech historical figures, whose eyes seemed to follow every gesture, every expression, every carefully calculated response to questions that could determine whether I walked out of this building or disappeared into the kind of custody that left families wondering forever. "Agent Sarah Mitchell," Novak began, consulting a file that was disturbingly thick for someone who supposedly maintained perfect operational security. 8 years with the Central Intelligence Agency. Fluent in 7 languages. Specialized in deep cover infiltration operations across 4 continents. Current clearance level that would impress most cabinet members. He turned a page with theatrical precision. Also known as Dr. Sarah Reynolds, Art Authentication Specialist. And to your family, a disappointing State Department clerk who processes visa applications and attends boring conferences about cultural exchange programs. The accuracy of his intelligence made my stomach clench. This wasn't information gathered through standard surveillance. This was the kind of detailed psychological profile that required assets inside American intelligence networks, possibly for years. "The bioweapons in that vault," I said, ignoring his character assessment, "they're not just stored here. You're planning to let the sale proceed." Novak's smile was thin and calculated. "Those weapons represent 18 months of careful cultivation. We allowed certain parties to believe they could acquire materials that would shift regional power balances in their favor. Meanwhile, we documented every contact, every financial transaction, every transportation method. Tomorrow night's sale will provide us with intelligence about terrorist financing networks that your agency has been chasing unsuccessfully for over a decade. A honey trap. The Czechs were running their own operation, using biological weapons as bait to expose terrorist networks, while American intelligence stumbled around trying to prevent what was actually an elaborate sting operation. My missing agents, I continued. Are they alive? Agents Harrison, Webb, and Santos are currently enjoying accommodations similar to your own. They'll be released after tomorrow night's operation concludes successfully. Consider them insurance against American interference in our domestic intelligence gathering. My phone, which Novak had placed in the center of the table like evidence in a trial, buzzed with another incoming call. The display showed Mom again, and even from across the table I could see the timestamp indicating she'd been trying to reach me for over an hour. Your stepfather, Novak said conversationally, suffered a massive coronary event approximately 2 hours ago. Current status is critical but stable. Your family is gathered at Greenwich Hospital, where they're discovering that their daughter's emergency contact information includes phone numbers that trace back to Langley, Virginia. The blood drained from my face. Emergency contact protocols meant that when family members called hospitals asking for next-of-kin notification procedures, they were eventually connected to CIA personnel, who had to navigate requests for information about agents whose existence was classified. My mother doesn't know, I said quietly. Not yet, but hospital administrators are asking increasingly specific questions about your employment status. Questions that your cover office at the State Department cannot adequately answer without raising additional inquiries about why a visa processing clerk requires classified emergency contacts. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum disguised as friendly advice. Agent Mitchell, your family is approximately 6 hours away from learning that everything you've told them for the past 8 years has been elaborate deception. Your mother will discover that while she believed you were filing immigration paperwork in comfortable embassy offices, you were actually conducting operations in Syria that involved chemical weapons facilities. Your sister will learn that your boring conferences in Vienna were actually coordination meetings with British intelligence about human trafficking networks. The interrogation room felt smaller suddenly, walls closing in with the weight of consequences I'd spent years trying to prevent. Every family gathering where I'd deflected questions, every phone call where I'd invented mundane details about non-existent diplomatic receptions, every careful lie designed to protect them from the truth, all of it was about to unravel in a hospital waiting room while they worried about Richard's survival. What do you want? I asked. Novak consulted his file again. Your cooperation in tomorrow night's operation. You'll maintain your Dr. Reynolds' identity, attend the weapons sale as scheduled, and provide real-time intelligence about the buyer's security protocols and financial networks. In exchange, we'll ensure your family receives accurate information about your stepfather's condition and appropriate cover stories about your delayed return to the United States. And if I refuse, then your family discovers the truth under the worst possible circumstances. Your cover identity becomes useless for future operations, and 3 American agents remain in Czech custody while we proceed with our operation using less reliable intelligence sources. My phone buzzed again. This time, the display showed Emma calling, followed immediately by a text message preview that I could read even from across the table. Mom can't stop crying, please come home. Whatever you're angry about. The irony was devastating. My family was finally reaching out, finally asking me to come home, finally acknowledging that our relationship mattered, just as my 8 years of careful deception were about to explode in their faces. There's another option, Novak said, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic. You could tell them the truth yourself. Tonight, before hospital administrators connect dots that will raise questions you're not prepared to answer. Tell them the truth. After 8 years of lies, after missing Christmas dinners and birthday parties and graduations because of classified assignments, after watching them dismiss my achievements because they didn't know those achievements existed, he was suggesting I simply pick up the phone and explain everything. They won't believe me. Quote, Agent Mitchell, your mother is currently sitting in a hospital waiting room, terrified that her husband might die before she can reconcile with the daughter she spent 8 years misunderstanding. Your sister is calling you because for the first time in her adult life, she realizes she might lose someone she's taken for granted. They're not in a position to disbelieve anything you tell them, they're in a position to finally listen. He slid my phone across the table toward me. One conversation. Complete honesty about who you are and what you do. In exchange, we provide medical updates about your stepfather and coordinate with American intelligence to ensure your family's safety during tomorrow night's operation. I stared at the phone, thinking about all the conversations I'd imagined having over the years. Moments when I'd fantasized about telling my mother about the lives I'd saved, the attacks I'd prevented, the sacrifices I'd made in service of values she'd raised me to believe in. But in those fantasies, the revelations came during peaceful family dinners, not crisis calls from hospital waiting rooms. If I tell them everything, I said slowly, and they can't handle it, then at least they'll understand why you've been absent, why you've seemed distant, why you've built walls they couldn't scale. Novak's expression was almost kind. Agent Mitchell, your family doesn't need you to be perfect. They need you to be present, and presence requires honesty. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from my mother. Sarah, I know you're angry, and I know I said terrible things, but Richard is asking for you, and I don't know how to reach you, and I'm scared, and please just call me back. Richard was asking for me, the man who'd raised me, who'd offered me a corner office in his law firm, who'd never understood why I'd chosen government service over financial security. He was lying in a hospital bed, asking for the stepdaughter he'd always considered a disappointment. I picked up the phone and looked at Novak. If I do this, if I tell them everything, what guarantee do I have that they'll be protected? The same guarantee you've been operating under for 8 years, Agent Mitchell. The hope that truth serves better than deception, and that the people who love you are stronger than you've given them credit for being. Quote, I scrolled through my contacts to find Mom and held my finger over the call button while considering 8 years of careful lies balanced against 1 moment of complete honesty. Outside the interrogation room, Prague continued its ancient rhythm of secrets and revelations, power and compromise, truth and consequences. But inside this sterile chamber, the only choice that mattered was whether to finally trust my family with the truth I'd been protecting them from, or continue protecting them from the truth they deserved to know. I pressed the call button and waited for my mother's voice to bridge the gap between who she thought I was and who I'd actually become. The phone rang twice before my mother's voice broke through, raw with exhaustion and fear. Sarah? Oh, thank God, where are you? The hospital keeps asking these strange questions about your employment, and I don't understand. Mom, stop. My voice cut through her panic with a firmness she'd never heard from me before. I need you to listen very carefully. Richard is going to be fine, but there are things I have to tell you that are going to be difficult to understand. General Novak watched from across the table, his expression unreadable as I prepared to detonate 8 years of carefully constructed lies with a single conversation. Sarah, you're scaring me. What kind of questions? The hospital administrator mentioned something about classified emergency contacts, and I told them that was impossible because you work for the State Department processing visas. I've never processed a single visa in my life. The words came out harder than I intended, years of suppressed frustration bleeding through. Mom, I work for the Central Intelligence Agency. I have for 8 years. Everything I've told you about my job has been a lie designed to protect you from the truth. Silence. Complete, devastating silence that stretched across international phone lines and 8 years of fractured family relationships. Sarah, that's not possible. You're not that kind of person. You dropped out of law school. You've always been so ordinary. I speak 7 languages fluently. I've prevented 3 terrorist attacks that would have killed thousands of Americans. And right now I'm sitting in a Czech intelligence facility trying to stop biological weapons from being sold to people who want to commit genocide. My voice was steady now, professional. I'm many things, Mom, but ordinary isn't one of them. Through the phone, I could hear the chaos of a hospital waiting room, crying children, medical equipment beeping, Emma's voice in the background asking who I was talking to. But my mother's world had just shifted on its axis. The conferences in Vienna? The boring embassy work in Morocco? Vienna was a human trafficking investigation that rescued 47 children from slavery. Morocco was an arms-dealing network that we dismantled before they could supply weapons to terrorist cells across North Africa. I paused, letting the magnitude sink in. Every time you complained about my job being beneath my potential, I was actually serving at the highest levels of national security. But why? Why would you lie to us? Why wouldn't you tell us you were doing something important? The question I'd dreaded for 8 years, delivered in a voice so small and broken that it nearly shattered my professional composure. Novak leaned forward slightly, understanding that this moment would determine whether his psychological manipulation succeeded. Because people who want to hurt me could use you as leverage. Because the less you knew, the safer you were. Because I watched other agents lose family members when their covers were blown, and I couldn't risk that happening to you. My throat tightened with emotion I'd suppressed for years, and because I knew you'd worry constantly if you understood what I actually do. Worry? My mother's laugh was bitter and incredulous. Sarah, I've worried about you every day for 8 years. I worried that you were wasting your life, that you were ashamed of us, that you'd chosen loneliness over family because we somehow failed you as parents. The accusation hit harder than any interrogation technique. While I'd been protecting them from imaginary threats, they'd been suffering from very real emotional wounds that my deception had inflicted. I was never ashamed of you, I said quietly. I was protecting you the only way I knew how. By lying to us? By making us feel like we didn't matter enough for you to share your real life? Emma's voice came through the phone now, sharp with 8 years of accumulated resentment. Sarah, do you have any idea what it's been like watching Mom cry after every family gathering because her daughter treats us like we're not worth her time? Quote. Novak made a note in his file, probably cataloging the psychological pressure points that could be exploited in future operations. But all I could think about was my mother crying. My brilliant, strong mother who'd raised me to believe I could accomplish anything, reduced to tears because I'd convinced her I'd accomplished nothing. Emma, I've missed family gatherings because I was preventing attacks on American soil. I've seemed distant because I was carrying classified information that could get people killed if I accidentally revealed it. I've built walls because loving you meant keeping you safe from a world you didn't need to know existed. But we did need to know, my mother said, her voice strengthening with understanding. Not the details, not the classified parts, but we needed to know that our daughter was someone we could be proud of. We needed to know that the woman we raised was making a difference in the world. Through the phone, I heard Richard's voice, weak but unmistakable. Patricia, is that Sarah? Tell her I'm proud of her. Whatever she's done, wherever she's been, I'm proud. The stepfather who'd offered me a corner office in his law firm, who'd never understood my career choice, was lying in a hospital bed telling my mother he was proud of me before he even knew what I'd accomplished. Richard wants to talk to you, my mother said. Put me on speaker. A moment of shuffling, then Richard's voice came through clearly. Sarah? Sweetheart, are you really CIA? Yes, Richard, I really am. And you've been doing this dangerous work for 8 years without telling us because you were protecting us? Yes. A pause, then a sound I'd never heard from him before. Laughter, genuine and warm. Christ, Sarah. I offered you a job doing corporate contracts when you were already running international intelligence operations. No wonder you turned me down. Despite everything, the interrogation room, the biological weapons, the Czech intelligence officers watching my every reaction, I started laughing too. 8 years of family tension dissolving in a hospital waiting room confession that should have happened years ago. Richard, you had a heart attack because you thought I was a disappointment. I couldn't live with that anymore. Disappointment? His voice was stronger now, indignant. Sarah, I had a heart attack because I'd been working 80-hour weeks trying to build a legacy worthy of a daughter I never understood was already building her own legacy protecting the country I love. Novak slid another document across the table, medical reports showing Richard's condition had stabilized, that the immediate crisis had passed. But more importantly, it showed that my family was finally learning who I really was under circumstances where they could handle the truth. Mom, I said, I need to finish something here in Prague, something important. But I promise you, no more lies. When I come home, we'll talk about everything. All of it. When will you be home? The question carried 8 years of hope and fear. I looked at Novak, who nodded almost imperceptibly. The operation would conclude tomorrow night, one way or another. 48 hours, maybe less. And Mom? The next time you're worried about me, remember that I'm very good at what I do. I've been keeping myself safe for 8 years while keeping other people safe too. I love you, Sarah. We all do. We always have, even when we didn't understand. I love you too, all of you. That's why I've spent 8 years lying to protect you. After I ended the call, Novak closed his file and studied me with what might have been respect. That was well handled, Agent Mitchell. Your family appears more resilient than you anticipated. They always have been. I just never trusted them with the chance to prove it. And now? Tomorrow night's operation. Will you provide the intelligence we need? I considered the question while thinking about Richard asking for me, about my mother's tears, about Emma finally understanding why I'd seemed absent from their lives. My family knew the truth now, which meant the primary reason I'd maintained my cover had just evaporated. General, I'll provide intelligence support for your operation on one condition. When it's over, when your sting concludes successfully, I want those bioweapons destroyed. Not stored, not studied, not kept as insurance against future threats. Destroyed completely. Novak smiled. Agent Mitchell, that was always the plan. Some weapons are too dangerous to exist, regardless of their intelligence value. As Czech security personnel escorted me to more comfortable accommodations, I realized that tonight had changed everything. Not just my relationship with my family, but my understanding of what protection actually meant. I'd spent 8 years protecting them from truth, when what they'd really needed was protection from lies. Tomorrow night, I would help Czech intelligence conclude their operation. I would ensure that biological weapons never reached terrorist hands. I would coordinate with American assets to bring 3 missing agents home safely. But most importantly, I would do it all as Sarah Mitchell, not as Dr. Sarah Reynolds or any other carefully constructed identity. For the first time in 8 years, my family knew who I was and what I did, and they were proud rather than disappointed. The truth, it turned out, was the most powerful weapon I'd ever deployed. And unlike biological agents or explosive devices, it had the power to heal rather than destroy. As Prague settled into late-night quiet around me, I finally understood what my mother had meant about being present. Presence wasn't about physical attendance at family dinners. It was about emotional honesty in every conversation. The catalyst that had begun with an encrypted phone call during Sunday dinner was ending with the most important call I'd ever made. The lies were finally over. The truth had set us all free. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.